In 1925, the trial of John T. Scopes, a young schoolteacher who volunteered to test the law banning the teaching of evolution in Tennessee schools, became a national cause célèbre. The case pitted fundamentalist religion against science, social conservatives against liberals and social progressives, rural America against the growing cities, the Midwest and South against Northeastern elites. It was an opening salvo in a culture war that's very familiar to us today. 1925 was also possibly the greatest publishing year in American literary history. The year of Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, Hemingway's In Our Time, Dreiser's An American Tragedy, and Alain Locke's The New Negro, which heralded the Harlem Renaissance, as well as books by Sinclair Lewis, John Dos Passos, Willa Cather, and Gertrude Stein.
It was called the trial of the century. And if that means anything, what that meant to me is that competing ideas about what it means to be an American and what it means to live here in a democracy are really thrashed out in the courtroom. Otherwise, why would it be a trial of the American century? But what this trial did, and the reason I think it was called the trial of the century, is that it really brought to a head two main cultural and later, and now political groups. On the one hand, you had the fundamentalist, which, to just put it simply, read the Bible literally. And the other group, called the modernist, not necessarily what we think of as modernism in literature and art, although it's linked. The modernists read the Bible more as poetry. They were a more liberal uh, branch of the Protestant clergy, and they congregated around certain ideas that we do associate with modernism. There was another group that was involved too, in addition to these two poles, and that was the American Civil Liberties Union, which is still around today. It was pretty new in 1925. It had only been founded 5 years earlier, and it had been founded to protect civil liberties. And to the ACLU, the Butler Act violated the guarantee of religious liberty as stipulated in the Constitution. So what they did is offer to defend anyone willing to test the law by breaking it. And it was John Scopes, a young biology teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, who also happened to be the football coach, which is, I suppose, relevant to today. He stepped up and said, you can't teach biology without teaching evolution. At that point, the fundamentalists asked William Jennings Bryan, three-time presidential candidate, to prosecute Scopes. Bryan at the time was very well known. He'd been Secretary of State under Wilson, and he was eager to take up this cause. He said, for example, that this would be a duel to the death for or on behalf of Christianity. Opposing him was a man named Clarence Darrow, who was very famous in his own time and up until maybe even the present. He volunteered to defend Scopes pro bono. He was a labor lawyer, a criminal lawyer, and a very, very famous at the time agnostic who said we all have a right to worship or not to worship. And he went to Dayton, Tennessee, as did Bryan, and he said to fight bigots and ignoramuses and fanatics from controlling education. Okay, that's just the background. We all know that. But when I begin a book, I always begin with a question. And in this case, it was a simple question, really. It was, what was going on here? Was this really the circus that it was made out to be? It was familiarly called at the time and subsequently the monkey trial, where nothing more important than hot dogs and ice cream would be sold and a boost for the civic economy. My question was, well, if that's all it was, why were these two celebrated figures called to battle? And why was the trial covered internationally and certainly coast to coast in the United States. And was it really about evolution, which technically speaking, nobody really understood? Nobody understood the actual science of evolution. And evolution, as I said, had been around for a long time. It had been as accepted, say, as the theory of gravity. So what I wanted to do is open up the framework, kind of get what we call today kind of a wider lens on the 1920s, and in particular 1925, because generally speaking, I find that literature and history are really very tightly woven together.